welcome to all those in on the call, of which there are many, for the discussion on Dark Emu, Bruce Pascoe and the Hunter-Gatherer controversy with Geoffrey Blainey and Warren Mundine. As I've said before, we can't do personal meetings at the moment, but it's great doing these functions because it involves many of our members and supporters who live outside of Sydney. Both the speakers are very well known. We're going to lead off with Warren Mundine. Now, Warren Mundine has been an advisor in Indigenous affairs for many years with various governments. He's also an author, most recently of Black and White, his memoir, and Speaking My Mind. Professor Geoffrey Blainey. Geoffrey Blainey is perhaps Australia's most highly regarded historian, a long-time historian of Australia, and other works, but his most recent book, and he spoke here on this, is Before I Forget, which was an early part of his memoir. Now, both Warren and Geoffrey have spoken here before, and it's great to have them back. So we'll lead off with Warren, and then we'll go to Geoffrey, and then we'll go to questions and discussion. Warren?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. And I'd like to say I'm pleased to be on the stage here with Professor Geoffrey Blainey, who is a very esteemed historian and a great commentator in the Australian mix. I hadn't taken much notice of Dark Emu in the first few years when it first came out. I was looking and doing other things, but in the last couple of years, when this controversy started blowing up, especially about his Aboriginality and about some of the issues that were in the book, a friend of mine gave me a book and said, "You should read this." And I thought, okay, I would. So I did. So last year, while we were very much locked up in COVID, I had to find my time. So I went and read the book. One of the things I've really got to talk about in Aboriginal culture, and that is that through your history, through your background, you have songlines, you have stories that talk about a wide range of things, about how your culture and how your community is, and also about your Dreamtime stories and your history. And that's all done through stories. It's all done through storylines. What I found within the Dark Emu book was that Bruce Pascoe takes some relevant historical truths and then blows them up into these massive ideas of about agriculture. Aboriginals had agriculture. We had townships. We had villages, 1,000 people, and so on. The problem, and also he sort of, to me, takes a Euro-centric approach to things, like downplaying the hunter-gatherer societies. Now, in my community, which is the Bundjalung community, we have no stories of villages of 1,000 people. We have no stories of towns. We don't have stories of agriculture to the type of agriculture that he was talking about, and also agriculture in regard to the fencing and having animals and that. We had more of a hunter-gatherer society, a typical hunter-gatherer society. We moved around. We did stay in places, and we did have some large gatherings, like the Gumigara, which is a big ceremony on Heaven's Head up on the north coast of New South Wales. And that was a large gathering, but it wasn't a village. It was just a gathering for that ceremony, and over that few days that it was there, and then everyone went back to where they come from. I come from the Western Bundjalung areas, which is northwest of Grafton or west of Lismore. And I just found this quite interesting, that if what he's saying is true, and I've met many Aboriginals all across Australia, then we would have those stories. We'd have these songlines about what our communities were about. And this is a thing that I find quite fascinating about the whole thing, is that we can't find any. There is no there's no conversations, there's no traditional stories about them, and there's and it's just sort of like a blank about what he talks about. And I talk about it in the sense of he's Eurocentric, because he's trying to lift Aboriginal culture and sees it as he has to do that in regard to being equal to the European culture that was happening, in Europe, where they had agriculture, they had towns and villages and cities and all that type of stuff. And he sort of plays down this idea of being a hunter-gatherer. And one of the things I'm very proud of is that being a hunter-gatherer society, we survived so long in this continent. And this continent was a very tough. It was hot. It had droughts. We got through ice ages, and we got through bushfires. We got through a whole wide range of things as a society, and we had technology in that helped us through that. Like when you look at fire management and how that gave us open spaces and that, so we could hunt and hunt kangaroos and many other animals and that. I just couldn't believe what I was reading, and I find it quite bizarre that we have this book that is being taught as fact in schools and taught as fact within our universities, when there's no evidence of actually supporting the exaggerated, as I see it, a way that Aboriginals are living, and also looking at it and trying to say we invented all these different things and did all these great things, sort of trying to compare us to European society. And I think that's we're two worlds apart in regard to that. Here you had a civilization in Europe which had advanced itself over many, many hundreds of years, and you looked at Aboriginal society in Australia, where we were a constant society, and our history and our stories and that are based on that, is that we were a hunter-gatherer society, and I have not heard within the Aboriginal community from my life, going back to the 60s where I grew up, and from my grandparents and my parents and so on, any of the stuff that he raises and talks about it. So I just find it interesting, to be polite. I think and I'm publicly said this, that the book shouldn't be treated as non-fiction, and it shouldn't be taught in such a way to kids and to university students as a factual way that Aboriginal people were living prior to Europeans coming to Australia. So that's sort of, I'd be interested to see what Geoff thinks, but I just find that it downplays the tradition of Aboriginal people, our hunter-gatherer societies, and it also exaggerates and just makes up things in regard to how we live. Thank you.
Warren, thanks very much, and you're right on time, so well done on two accounts. And as Margaret Kelly said, just as we started, it's great to have you and Geoffrey both on the same platform speaking for us. So now we go to Geoffrey.
Gerard, thanks for the introduction, and very good to be with Warren. In 1975, I wrote a book, and I was so impressed with the Hunter-Gatherer Society that I'd inspected that I called the book The Triumph of the Nomads. I still hold to that view that it's a most distinctive society with many disadvantages, but many advantages. And many aspects of it are highly ingenious. Bruce Pascoe has written two influential books on Aboriginal history. As he claims to be Aboriginal, many readers think that he has very special knowledge. Certainly, he writes engagingly. He chats with his readers and then moves on to another topic. He collects snippets of the latest research, and those scholars whom he quotes probably feel some empathy with him. He also, I read, gives hope to the young. He gives them a belief that they can change the world. He says they can change the world if they emulate the best features of Aboriginal society. But the society he depicts is not really the society that I think it was. What Bruce Pascoe's audience does not realise is that most of his major viewpoints are imagined. He seems to make up a lot of his history. He displays his way out ideas, mostly in the big themes. He has declared, and you really have to blink at this, that Aboriginal Australia was the birthplace of democracy. He wrote, of all the systems humans have devised to manage their lives on Earth, Aboriginal government looks most like the democratic model. To me, that seems make-believe. The typical Aboriginal form of government worked very well for them, but it has very little similarity to what we think of democracy. The typical Aboriginal form of government had no parliament, no elections, no formula for removing rulers, and no recognised way of dramatically reforming society. Pascoe argues that Aboriginal democracy has been here for 80,000 years. That's almost 78,000 years before democracy was born in ancient Athens. And the greetings which we now hear Aboriginal leaders recite at a wide range of public gatherings are said to be traditional in spirit. I don't think you could call them democratic. Their hallmark is a simple tribute to the elders, past and present. To be older or old, that's what the word elder usually means. To say this is not to disown these early Aboriginal people. Their respect for the old and the experienced was probably normal in the whole world for most of human history. It was normal, I assume, for Warren's far-off ancestors and mine too. Bruce Pascoe is said to have made other astonishing discoveries. Aboriginal Australia, he tells us, was a haven of transcontinental peace, perhaps a world first. The peace apparently reigned in Aboriginal Australia long before most of Europe was settled. This is the final sentence in the schoolroom book, which he calls Young Dark Emu. He says, where else on earth was there a civilization that lasted more than 80,000 years and depended on both agriculture and peace? I myself don't believe it was any more a haven of peace than was the first half of the 20th century in Europe and Asia and our part of the world. Wars between Europeans have been common. Wars between Aboriginal groups were also frequent. This, as far as we can learn, was also true of nomadic societies in other parts of the world. I don't believe myself those universities which teach that Aboriginal peoples lived in a paradise of peace. Pascoe, of course, is quite right to denounce the frequent killing of Aboriginals. He's right to deplore the massacres, one of which occurred at Coniston in the Northern Territory, I think about 250 miles northwest of Alice Springs. One occurred at Coniston, a terrible massacre, as late as 1928. Curiously, a survivor died recently, aged 101. Pascoe, however, could be on very slippery ground in claiming that the massacres and the terrible cruelties were covered up by the early settlers. He says they are rarely mentioned in Australian history books because they were covered up so effectively. No, They are mentioned in a few hundred books. I confess that I've written some of them, for better or worse. Admittedly, the writing of history is a difficult craft or profession. We all make mistakes, but here the mistakes in his books, not only on a large scale, but embracing events and trends that are really too important to be turned into fantasy. For example, his view of the Torres Strait Islanders cannot be accepted. He treats them as if they were the same people as the Aboriginal peoples. Readers are left to assume that the Torres Strait Islanders were here for 80,000 years. In fact, their history in Torres Strait goes back fewer than 4,000 years. What a huge difference in time. And of course, the Torres Strait Islanders were gardeners, and as far as we know, the Aboriginal peoples were not. It's true that many generations of Aboriginals were often treated poorly and miserably by the incoming Europeans. They called the 26th of January 1788 the Invasion Day. But for the Torres Strait Islanders, their Invasion Day by the London Missionary Society was in 1871 and is still celebrated as the coming of the light. Alas, Bruce Pascoe, hostile to Christianity, has wiped the Torres Strait Islands from the map in his two books. If, like Bruce Pascoe, you see Aboriginal history as a long saga of peace and prosperity, how do you handle the catastrophes that disrupted Aboriginal life for thousands of years? This is one of the remarkable things about Aboriginal history, the ability of the people to live through such incredible events and survive, their spirit, as far as we know, unbroken. Perhaps Bruce Pascoe leaves these events out of his histories. For more than 10,000 years, these Aboriginal people inhabited the changing coastline and saw with obvious alarm the seas rise and rise. It was in Aboriginal times, in relatively recent times in the long Aboriginal history, that New Guinea was cut off from Australia and Tasmania was cut off from the mainland. Perhaps 1/4 of Australia went under the seas and is still drowned. This catastrophe, by the way, makes the rising of the seas, widely predicted for the next 100 years, seem just like a trickle. In those times, the starvation, which must have hit many coastal regions, as they lost nearly all their source of food, and the tensions and maybe the occasional warfare when the coast dwellers retreated century after century. There's nothing about that in Bruce Pascoe's books. Bruce Pascoe disputes that the Aboriginals were not skilled nomadic peoples who moved about according to the seasons, utilising their wide knowledge of plant life and animal life. He argues instead that they were farmers who planted and harvested crops and lived in permanent villages and towns and stored large quantities of food for the 11 or 12 months until the next harvest. I think even in high rainfall areas where Aborigines were said to be farmers, even in those areas, their production of grain was very small. In Bruce Pascoe's book, he gives an example of a very big granary, a big hoard of grain, which held 1 ton of grain. I happened to meet Rod Gillespie, who has the largest chain of bakeries in Australia, and I asked him what he thought about that. And he said, if you have to hoard your food until the next harvest, a ton won't go very far. In a town of 1,000 people, it would only feed them for 2 days. And that would only happen if the grass seeds that they were grinding happened to be very nutritional, and you can't be sure that they were. Pascoe declares that the Aboriginal grain belt covered a huge area of the continent. On his map, the Aboriginal grain belt crossed the continent from west to east like a giant rainbow. In a north-south direction, their grain belt, he alleges, ran from the present Mount Gambier in South Australia almost to Mount Isa, or almost to the Gulf of Carpentaria. But there's a catch. You can't really believe that this huge grain belt existed in that fashion. This allegedly enormous grain belt of the alleged Aboriginal farmers includes most of the large 5 deserts in Australia. This grain belt includes the Simpson Desert, the Great Sandy Desert, the Great Victoria Desert, which is not in Victoria, the Tanami Desert, and the Gisborne Desert. Incidentally, not one of those deserts is on the map in the Emu books, not one desert. The idea of this great grain belt conducted by these farmers is far-fetched. It was, if it existed, it would be very small and confined to the high rainfall areas of Australia. The book Dark Emu, or Young Dark Emu, is handsome. It's almost a work of art, but to my mind, it's quite unsuited for schools. It has very little information. Nearly half of the book is illustrations. The nomadic Aboriginal Australians and their distinctive way of life does not receive justice in the book. And why should education departments praise a book which is so wrong on major themes? Why should they prescribe a book which is so hostile to Australian people of many backgrounds and delivers such exaggerated attacks about their culture and their loyalties? The intellectual arrogance of Europeans is one of Pascoe's frequent comments. He goes on to say, European and Asian cultures are suffused with violence and war. It gives pleasure, I know, to many readers. All honour to him. But is it history? One thing that he can't be expected to know is that recent research in the last 10 years shows that Australia was a much more difficult place to live in than we imagined. Holes drilled into the East Antarctic reveal that Australia had droughts which we can't conceive. There was one drought in the 12th century AD, and that was a very dry century, which lasted in many parts of Australia for 39 years. Just imagine the difficulties of surviving in a drought like that, and yet the Aboriginals did. Much more could be said about the Emu books. It's sufficient to say that Bruce Pascoe has accepted what's called the Enterprise Chair in Indigenous Agriculture at Melbourne University, judged, and I think rightly, to be Australia's greatest research university at present. Will Chinese students who study there and know their own go-by desert blink when they read about these Australian deserts and the farms they allegedly nourished? Did the agriculture faculty, where Bruce is apparently teaching, explain to the university heads that there were doubts about Pascoe's knowledge of agriculture? I think the university has not yet justified the appointment. If I may conclude, Warren's early address was forthright and timely. Why should people who pretend to be Aboriginal claim privileges rightly designed for others? I've read your comments in other sources, Warren, about Bruce Pascoe's ancestry and his claim to have a large amount of Aboriginal descent, and you say that evidence for this does not exist. The practice is now on a large scale of pretending to be an Aboriginal. In the year 2016, which is our latest census to be fully counted, the scoreboard for the Aborigines who filled in their form in that census, and for all the Indigenous people, disclosed a remarkable fact that in the 10 years up to 2016, the Indigenous population expanded at three times the rate of the mainstream population of Australia. And demographers who've done recent research on that census argue that half of the increase in the Indigenous people come from people who in the census for the first time said that they were Aboriginal. The evidence that they were is very doubtful indeed. So it remains a very important topic. And if a referendum is eventually to be held on some special recognition of Aboriginals, that question just has to be solved. You can't have a section of the Parliament or a section of the Constitution singling out the special role of the Aboriginals and the rights they should have if you have not yet defined who is an Aboriginal person.
Thank you, Geoffrey. And so we come to questions and discussion. Remember, we're all on the record. There are a lot of people on the call. People have got to be brief. And you got a note earlier today about how to get into the discussion. So either put up the hand signal or, if you're desperate, wave to the camera. I see a few people have come on my screen, but it's probably best if you ask your questions yourself rather than me trying to read them off. So off we go. Now, I just talked to both of you briefly. As I understand it, Bruce Pascoe has pretty well avoided any discussion of his book. But on the 11th of September, he did publish an article in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, which really didn't deal with it. I mean, it spent, I think, the first 20% discussed the 1968 Olympic Games and the Australian sprinter Norman, who was a great sprinter and a fine man, but it didn't really have much to do with the topic. But when he did discuss it, he essentially said, look, in the book which we're discussing, which of course is Farmers or Hunter-Gatherers, the Dark Emu debate by Peter Sutton and Karen Walsh, he did say that insofar as he read the book, they agreed with him, but I'm not sure that the authors of that book would agree with that assessment. So how do you two see the Sutton-Walsh book? And do you think there's anything in it much that supports, well, they don't think so, but do you think there's anything in much that supports Bruce Pascoe's position?
Well, I don't think it supports his position. At times, of course, they're sympathetic to some of his arguments, but the overwhelming opinion of those who've read the new book published, I think, by Melbourne University Press, is that it's a very strong attack on Bruce Pascoe's main positions.
Warren, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, it was a clear outing of Bruce Pascoe's book. It was very timely because everyone was taking it as gospel that Dark Emu was this incredible hidden history that we didn't know about, and in actual fact that it wasn't true. My first book I read at university, Jeff, was Triumph of the Nomads, and I thought it was a great book. It was Pascoe. Sorry.
Pascoe, nothing. Go on, Warren.
Yeah, Pascoe. Like he talks. You talk about in his book. He talks about wars. That there was no wars in Australia. If there was no wars, then why in our songlines, in our ceremonies, we talk about wars? We talk about battles. We talk about conflicts that had happened. When you go to our law, it also talks that we have laws that talk quite clearly about behaviour and that, and what you should do and shouldn't do. And so this idea that we lived in this this paradise. I'm a very it had no wars or anything like that, is just total nonsense, because the actual facts are, if we didn't, then why have we got them in our stories? Why do we talk about them? Why do I've been to places where battles had happened between Aboriginal groups.
Anne.
Hi. I just wanted to ask both speakers, one from inside the Indigenous community, one from outside. The last point that Geoffrey made about identifying as an Australian Indigenous person, it's a vexed question, and it is very important. And I think Bruce Pascoe has made this even more important. How would both of you suggest that we could go about working out some way in which you can say this is a legitimate person with an Indigenous ethnic background? I mean, Jewish people take it from being born to a Jewish mother, and other people have national links and whatever. But how do we get to a point where we can define rationally who is a genuine Indigenous Australian?
Start off with Warren, go to Geoffrey. Warren?
Yeah, well, I was the Chief Executive Officer from the Native Title Services Corporation, NTS Corp. And we used to do the federal court cases on native title. Now, within the framework of that, we had to bring evidence before the federal court that was, really showed people's ancestry, had to show what group of people and geography that they actually come from. Now, interesting thing, this is why I find it interesting that he can't talk about, he says there's no evidence of his ancestry, is that in that I was 9 years as CEO in that organisation, and there was not one person that we could track and do research on, and because we had historians and anthropologists and that working with us, and they went through the whole genealogists and that, and there was not one person who come through to us that we could not say that they were definitely of Aboriginal descent, or they wasn't definitely of Aboriginal descent. And so I just find it funny that he can't say that he can't point to documents, he can't point to anything that shows that he is of Aboriginal descent, because we were able to find it anywhere. Even people who were taken away in the so-called stolen generation, we were able to find them. We track them down, find out who their grandparents, great-grandparents, was able to go back to the, right back to, around 700s.
Okay, thank you. Geoffrey?
I myself think that Indigenous people have to answer this question first. They're the ones that have an acute interest in this question. They're the ones who have to face the hostility if they make the wrong decision. But once you say we must have a special place in the Constitution or as an aid to parliamentary decisions, you have to suggest who we are. And the present definition, which says that if you claim to be Aboriginal descent and you're recognised as such by an Aboriginal community, I think is too open. Is too open to trickery or to illusions or so forth. It's just not a satisfactory definition.
Yeah, well, you got to. It is the first one we used was you got to be of Aboriginal descent, and don't pass that, then you're not. You can't be Aboriginal, and then the other two was you recognise yourself as an Aboriginal person, and that the community accepts you as an Aboriginal person. But you got to have all three. You just can't You just can't claim, I feel like an Aboriginal. And so if you can't pass the first test, which is you are of Aboriginal descent, then you're not Aboriginal.
Okay, so now we're going to go to Margaret Kelly, then we're going to go to Michael Bone. Margaret?
Hello. Look, I am so pleased to hear what you've had to say, Warren and Professor Blainey. Look, I am completely outraged by this individual. I worked for Charles Perkins back when he was an FAS in Aboriginal Affairs and before he went on to become secretary. I worked for Cedric Wyatt when he was Regional Director of Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales. Now, I am here to tell you that none of the stuff that I learned through these people and getting to know their various individual peoples, none of it stacks up with this guy.
Do you want to comment on that, Warren?
Well, I have not seen any evidence ever produced that he is of Aboriginal descent, and I know I think it's a pretty simple process for that to happen. It just all he needs to go is down to the Native Title Services, and they will go through it and prove whether he is or isn't. So by him not doing that or not being able to do that, I just find bizarre. And also, I think an introduction that was made that by Geoff that he lives off that Aboriginality. So I'm an Aboriginal person, therefore this book must be fair dinkum as well. In actual fact, as I keep on saying, I found nothing in that. I did find some parts, but he exaggerated them beyond belief. And he also he says things that are just fantasy, like that we didn't have war, and then why did we have war weapons, which is very common within Aboriginal groups, and why do we have stories that talk about conflicts and that as well, and why do we have our laws in regard to those things as well, the conduct of people? I just find that totally. I just can't believe it all. I think I just can't believe that people have actually, got sucked in by this.
Beata Lichter.
Thank you very much to both speakers. My question is, why do you think Australian academics would accept Bruce Pascoe's position without extensive analysis and debate?
The $64 question. I just can't believe it either, and especially after the recent book that's come out that really challenged it. And also when you in Aboriginal people, when you talk to them, except for this elite groups, they said what he talks about is not about our society. We're a very we're a hunter-gatherer society, and we were, and your Aboriginality is very easy to check. It's very easy to find out.
Geoffrey, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is that in literature and the arts in the last 40 years, great efforts have been made to encourage Indigenous people to contribute. And when somebody who's not an Indigenous person claims the prizes, it's very hard on the people who were runners-up and who miss out on the prizes. And I really think there should be some compensation in prizes given to these people who were runners-up and deserve to be the prize, but for the fact that the definition of the prize has been flaunted.
I think what's happening in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been this pressure about this collective about what is Aboriginal and what isn't Aboriginal, and if you don't agree with that, then you are a racist. And I think what happens to a lot of people that they become nervous and they become scared about that, and they get frightened that they could lose their job, whatever, because they get called out as being racist, and this is where the fear comes from.
Glenn Milne.
Hi, thank you to both of you for your contributions. I'd just like to put a proposition to you both to test, and that is the idea that this book and the theory behind it is fundamentally racist, in the sense that it seeks to elevate, in inverted commas, Aboriginal culture and society to meet Western standards. I'd just like to get your response to that proposition.
Within the Aboriginal community, that is right. That's how we do feel. We feel that, he's looking for this lens of Europeanness, and he sort of downplays or rubbishes hunter-gatherer societies, and we feel that from my family and my extensive talks to Aboriginal people out there, we find that very insulting, the way he treats us. And so because there are the good things, like how did we survive in this continent for so long, and as I said, going for ice ages and droughts and fires and all that type of these are very much triumphs of the hunter-gatherer society. And I agree with you, Glenn, that the way he looks at it is that we are sort of like subhuman in a sense to his own narrative.
We seem to swing between two things. And Geoffrey, you've done an enormous amount of anthropological work on this, and your books on it are fantastic. Could you just explain to us how we've developed our notion of what Indigenous culture and history is, and how we've come huge strides in understanding how intricate and sophisticated it was in its own way? But the average Australian doesn't. And there seems to be this notion that we do have to turn the savage into something noble and romantic, rather than confront the fact that this was a very clever society in its own origins.
It's as though the mainstream Australians, largely of European descent, I'm not sure whether to treat other people in their own terms, or whether to fit them entirely into their scheme of things. And I think that's a fairly human way of doing things, but it makes it very difficult for Aboriginal peoples when they have to walk the tightrope between those two very different demands.
Yeah, the things that worry me about when you start romanticising people, and you start looking, is that when people don't live up to that romanticism, they causes nothing but problems. And I just find it, there's good and bad within the Aboriginal community, just like there are in other communities. But this idea of trying to romanticise it, like and using the words that were no wars, or we didn't have any wars, so we must have been these wonderful people from the Garden of Eden. And it's dangerous, because it's fake history. It's fake stories about what real human beings were doing here. And look, it's fascinating. The history of Aboriginal people here and our art and everything, that is just it stands alone. It is what it is. And I just find it bizarre that Bruce Pascoe thought that he could write this book and make things up and romanticise. It's just, and looking through a very, almost in a racist way, about the hunter-gatherer societies, I just find this totally bizarre.
Michael Bohm and then John Fraser. Michael?
Mine's not a philosophic question, just a pragmatic one. Agricultural communities generally depend on implements to develop their agricultural skills. I don't remember Pascoe actually demonstrating that there were adequate items of equipment to sustain an agricultural community. There were implements that were useful in the warfare that Warren pointed out, but is there any pressure for a proper archaeological examination of the proposition that there were agricultural implements available to the Aboriginal societies before settlement?
Question, an archaeologist who's been in the field for the last 20 years about how that question should be answered. I mean, there are a lot of archaeologists in Australia, but it's not very easy to get sites where they're welcome, is it? The great heyday of archaeological discovery really was probably when John Mulvaney was the best known, the leading archaeologist in Australia, between about 1950 and 1985 and 1990. An enormous amount was known through archaeology, and I don't think the number of archaeologists in the field has kept up with the interest in the subject.
Now, yes, there were some tools that you could have used in regard to some agriculture, and there were some things that did, but not on the scale that he talks about. You know, it's sort of like comparing my tomato patch at home here to a massive farm that's just turning out tons and tons of wheat. You know, it's not feasible. Where does he find this stuff? There's no evidence of a lot of the stuff he's talking about.
Okay, so we're running to the end. We've got to finish in 10 minutes, so we've got to be brief. So I'm just going to go John Fraser, Janice Dawson, and Ross Fitzgerald, but we've got to be brief. So, John?
Right. It's related to the previous question. I have a bit of land around Camperdown in the Western District, and it's remarkable there that there has only been one finding of very minor archaeological evidence of Aboriginal habitation. If there were villages, you would think there would be far more than this. So it's really an observation, Gerard, than anything else. But I just thought I'd make it, because in buying a farm now, you've got to give undertakings that if you find Aboriginal relics, whatever you want to call it, you have to rightly protect them and register them. And that's just not the case.
Thanks for the observation. So Camperdown is in what, Western Victoria, right?
That's right, in a very fertile part of Western Victoria.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, but you do hit on a very good point. You know, like I sit there sometimes watching the History Channel here, and I see where archaeologists go out and do find villages and that, and you see Viking evidence of Vikings in certain parts of the world. You see evidence of people around the world who did these things, and you can see those relics. If he's talking, I just find it's mind-boggling when he's talking about these villages, people and that, because there's no evidence of it anywhere.
Janice Dawson and then Ross. Janice?
Thank you. What I find disturbing about Bruce Pascoe is that he claims in his book, and he's also claimed in various talks and speeches that he's given, that the history was deliberately hidden from Australians over the years. This so-called history of agriculture, that it was deliberately kept from us. Now, in Sutton's and Walsh's book, they set out clearly how many historians, how many archaeologists have written. They give proof. And I find it just hard to accept how many people have swallowed his story, that this history was hidden, so-called hidden from us. I'd be interested to hear comments from our speakers.
Let's start with Geoffrey, the historian.
Bruce Pascoe does go to town in saying that historians have not written about it, but if you look up the bibliography in his own book, there are many examples of historians and anthropologists who've done the very things he says, which have not been not been done.
Look, it's entire nonsense what he says, because from the early colonial period, even pre-colonial period in Australia, there's a whole lot of history from the Dutch and other people, and talking about their encounters with Aboriginal people. You see enormous literature about Indigenous people across this continent, and there's just a whole, as Geoff said, a bibliography of it in his own book. So there's this nonsense about it was deliberately, not only deliberately, cut out and hit and destroyed in a sense, but it doesn't test the reality of what happened. Like if you've got a village and it's built, and then you would find remnants of that somewhere. And if you have this idea of herding, I don't know where that come from, because I've been out hunting kangaroos, and I tell you what, it's very hard to herd them around, I can tell you, and fence them up. How big was the fence that keep the animals in? I just can't believe that people with any common sense. You don't have to be a historian, you don't have to be an archaeologist, and that. You just have to look at it and read it. Just say, well, that's impossible.
Final comment from Ross is never hunted kangaroos, but Ross.
Can you hear me, bro?
Yes.
Geoffrey and Warren, why do you think it was until relatively recently that so few contemporary academics, including academic historians, they didn't criticise Pascoe until the last couple of years?
I go back to my earlier point where it was because there were some Aboriginal academics who come out and supported him, and I think the whole push then become, okay, we don't want to be, don't want to rock the boat here. We don't want to be called racist. We don't want to be, hounded out of our profession, which does happen. So that's why there was a reluctance, and that's why the Sutton books was so important, so that we could hopefully open it up a lot wider, where we can challenge in that. And one of the things I find really weird about modern academia is that that's what history is about. That's what science is. That's what everything's about. That you actually challenge things, and then if it stands the test of that challenge, then it's true. But if it doesn't stand the test of the challenge, then it's not.
It is remarkable that so few criticisms have been made of him by historians. I think there's some fear in the universities now of speaking out on controversial subjects. They become like great corporations, and there's plenty of evidence of people having strong views and interesting views, but wondering whether it will affect their career. If they seem to be argumentative, means this is completely alien to the idea of a university.
Okay, now we've got room to fit Margaret Somerville in, but you've got to be quick. Margaret?
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to issue a warning that we have so much to learn in terms of virtues and ethics and so on from the Aboriginal population and from their culture. And I'm worried that this might sort of take away the credibility and the importance of that. So I think the criticisms have to be done in a way that they're very carefully confined to what Pascoe was dealing with, because I think we're on the Australians, and particularly the young ones, are very interested in what they can learn from going into a 60 to 80,000 year history and looking at how those societies survived. And to damage that would be really sad.
So Warren, a comment on Margaret Somerville's point?
I think you've got a very solid point there, because there is a danger of this, and this is why it makes me angry and a lot of other people angry with the Aboriginal community, that this could be very damaging, and at a time in Australian history when people really are interested in learning about Aboriginal culture, learning about Aboriginal people, that this could be very damaging to all that.
Final comment, Geoffrey?
Could I just finish with a general point? When the incoming British met the Aboriginals in 1788 and in various other places later, this was an unusual meeting in world history. Here were two societies that were so different. The society just entering the Industrial Revolution and the largest landmass in the world that was still possessed by hunters and gatherers, that we're still landed with the task of trying to understand each other. The societies were so far apart, each with their own various virtues and with their own distinctive history. And we still live with that legacy.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey and Warren. It's a great way to end. I just should remind everyone we're discussing farmers or hunter-gatherers, the dark emu debate by Peter Sutton, the social anthropologist, and Dr. Karen Walsh, the archaeologist, who's done a lot of work with Australian Aboriginal heritage sites and so forth. But for tonight, it's great to have people with such hands-on experience as Warren, who's worked in Indigenous affairs, and Geoffrey, who's worked as a historian, here today to talk about this important topic. Thanks to our speakers. It's been a terrific event, and thanks to all who contributed. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.